The barracks were always noisy, full of the chatter of young recruits who thought they already knew the world. The clang of boots against concrete, the laughter echoing in the halls, the metallic ring of rifles being slung onto shoulders, it was a rhythm she had grown used to even if she never truly fit into it. Her name was Arya, and unlike the others, she didn't rush toward the training field to prove her strength, nor did she boast about how many push-ups she could complete or how fast she could run the obstacle course. Instead, she sat quietly in the corner of the armory, her hands moving with steady patience over the steel of a rifle, polishing every inch until it gleamed. She was meticulous, careful, and silent. And because of that, they laughed at her. "Look at her," one of the recruits snickered, elbowing his friend as they passed by. "Always polishing those guns. Maybe she wants to marry one instead of actually shooting it." The room erupted in chuckles, the kind of sharp laughter that made its way into Arya's ears and tried to bury itself in her heart. She didn't respond, not with anger and not with words. Instead, she kept her focus on the barrel she was cleaning, turning it under the light, making sure not a single smudge remained. The truth was, Arya knew why she did it. She had grown up in a small village where her father had been a hunter. He always told her that a weapon was like a living thing. It demanded respect, care, and understanding. A careless hunter, he used to say, was not only a danger to himself but to everyone around him. She had learned to respect rifles long before she had ever learned to fire them. She had watched her father break down his old hunting rifle every night, clean it, and reassemble it with hands that never shook. When she asked him why, his answer was simple: "Because when the time comes, I can't afford for this to fail." That lesson had never left her, and now, even as others mocked her, she polished her weapons with the same quiet devotion. The commanders didn't seem to care much at first. As long as she followed orders, ran her drills, and completed her tasks, no one paid close attention to how she spent her free hours. But the recruits did. They whispered about her behind her back, calling her strange, saying she was obsessed with things that didn't matter. Some even went further, accusing her of wasting her time. "You'll never need all that shine," one of the boys sneered one evening. "When you're out there, no one's going to care how pretty your rifle looks." Arya looked up at him then, her dark eyes steady, her hands never stopping their motion on the cloth. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But when it matters, I'll know it won't fail me." Her words only earned more laughter, and the sound followed her like a shadow for weeks. Yet Arya wasn't blind to her own weaknesses. She wasn't the fastest runner in the drills, nor the strongest when it came to carrying heavy loads. Her endurance was average, her sparring unimpressive. She didn't stand out in the places where others shined, and that made her even more of an easy target. But what no one realized was that while they spent their evenings boasting, brawling, or collapsing from exhaustion, Arya was learning every detail of her weapon. She knew how every part fit together, how each sound it made hinted at its condition, how the weight shifted in her hands when it was ready to fire or when something was off. She was building not only familiarity but trust, and deep down she believed one day that trust would be tested. Her quiet nature also meant she spent more time observing than speaking. During shooting practice, she noticed how others struggled with their rifles. Some jammed because they hadn't been cleaned properly, others fired inaccurately because their sights weren't aligned. She said nothing, never pointing out what she saw, but the lessons gathered in her mind like drops of water filling a well. Her own shots were steady, but no one paid much attention because they weren't spectacular. She didn't show off, didn't push herself into the spotlight. She was content to learn, to practice, and to wait. One night, when the recruits were gathered around the fire pit outside the barracks, the topic of Arya came up again. "She's probably scared," one of them said with a grin. "Hides behind her cleaning because she's too afraid to actually use the gun." A few others nodded in agreement, but one recruit, a tall boy named Yarrick, smirked and added, "You'll see. When the real test comes, she'll freeze up. All that polishing won't save her then." Their laughter filled the night, and though Arya was sitting a little distance away, polishing a sidearm under the pale glow of the moon, she heard every word. She didn't flinch. She didn't rise to defend herself. She only whispered under her breath, "We'll see." For her, it wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving herself right, that the lessons her father had taught her, the patience she had nurtured, the respect she carried for her weapons, would one day matter in a way no one else could see now. And though no one believed it then, that day was coming sooner than any of them could imagine. The morning of the evaluation came with a sky the color of steel and a wind sharp enough to sting their cheeks. The recruits gathered at the edge of the training ground, nerves buzzing through the air like invisible electricity. The commanders stood tall, their voices booming as they explained the test ahead. It wasn't just another round of drills or obstacle runs. This was the simulated combat assessment, designed to separate the ones who had potential from those who would wash out. Failure wasn't just embarrassing, it could mean dismissal from the program entirely. The moment the announcement was made, silence settled over the group. No one wanted to be the one sent home in disgrace. The scenario was simple on paper: a mock enemy encampment set deep within the training forest. The recruits were to work in squads, infiltrate the perimeter, and disable key targets using paint-loaded rifles that mimicked the weight and mechanics of their real weapons. The instructors had designed the exercise to be as realistic as possible, complete with hidden traps, surprise ambushes, and the pressure of limited time. Success required precision, teamwork, and nerves of steel. For some, this was a chance to shine. For Arya, it was the test she had been quietly waiting for. Her squad was a mix of strong personalities, none of whom had ever taken her seriously. Yarrick was among them, naturally assuming the role of leader. He barked instructions with a confidence that came more from ego than skill, but the others followed him anyway. They didn't consult Arya, didn't ask for her input, and when she tried to suggest careful planning, her words were waved away like smoke in the wind. "Stay in the back," Yarrick muttered as they prepared to move out. "Try not to slow us down." She simply nodded, her face calm, though inside she repeated the words of her father: "Respect the weapon, respect the moment. Don't rush. Don't break." The squad moved quickly through the trees, leaves crunching under their boots, rifles raised. The first ambush came sooner than expected. Paint pellets whizzed past them, striking two of the recruits squarely on the chest. They cursed, eliminated from the game, forced to sit out as the instructors pulled them aside. Panic rippled through the squad, and Jarrek's voice rose above the gasp. "Push forward," he shouted, spraying fire blindly into the trees. His weapon jammed, the mechanism stuck because it hadn't been cleaned properly. He fumbled, cursing loudly while the enemy squad gained ground. Arya saw it all, her eyes narrowing, her hands steady as she raised her own rifle. She didn't waste ammunition. She didn't fire until she had a clear shot. When she squeezed the trigger, her pellet struck one of the hidden attackers cleanly on the helmet, dropping him from the exercise. Another careful shot followed, and another enemy went down. Her squad barely noticed. They were too busy shouting, scrambling, and trying to make up for their mistakes. But the instructors noticed. From their observation posts, they tracked the precision of her shots, the way she conserved her resources, and the calm with which she moved. Where others stumbled, she adjusted. Where others panicked, she breathed slowly and aimed true. As they pressed deeper into the forest, the tension grew heavier. Time was slipping away, and their squad had been reduced to half its size. Yarrick was growing desperate, his voice cracking as he demanded they move faster. He ignored the signs of traps in the underbrush, leading them straight into a hidden snare that triggered a barrage of pellets. Another recruit was taken out, leaving only Arya, Yarrick, and one more. Arya tried to warn them, but her words were brushed aside once again. Still she kept her calm. She knew the map in her mind, every sound, every shadow. She didn't argue, she simply adapted. Finally, they reached the clearing where the mock encampment stood, guarded by the last of the enemy recruits. Yarrick, reckless to the end, charged forward, firing wildly until his rifle jammed again. He was struck almost immediately, disqualified with a bright streak of paint across his chest. He shouted in frustration, throwing the rifle aside, his arrogance collapsing into shame. That left Arya and the last recruit, a nervous boy who looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. For the first time someone asked her, "What do we do?" Arya knelt low, her voice steady and calm. "Stay behind me. Wait for my signal. Don't waste your shots." She scanned the field, noting the positions of the defenders, the way they moved, the gaps between their cover. She adjusted her rifle, her polished weapon smooth and perfect in her hands. With measured breaths she took her shots, one by one, deliberate, precise. Each target fell. The boy followed her lead, taking down another when she pointed him toward it. Together they dismantled the defense step by step, until the final target was struck and the encampment cleared. The horn sounded, signaling the end of the exercise. Silence stretched over the forest before the instructors' voices broke it with sharp commands to regroup. When the squads returned, battered and covered in paint, Arya's group was the only one to have completed the mission. Yarrick walked with his head down, bitterness etched across his face, while the others stared at Arya with something new in their eyes, something that wasn't laughter anymore. For the first time, they began to understand that her patience, her polishing, her quiet focus hadn't been weakness. It had been preparation. The weeks after the evaluation changed everything for Arya. No one laughed when they saw her polishing her weapons anymore. The same recruits who had once mocked her now watched in silence, some even glancing at their own rifles with a new sense of guilt. They still didn't speak to her much, not directly, but the tone had shifted. She was no longer the outcast they had dismissed as strange. She was the girl who had carried her squad to victory when everyone else had failed. Even the instructors, usually hard and unyielding, had begun to take notice. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Captain Vaynar, made a habit of stopping by the armory in the evenings, watching her work without interrupting. His sharp eyes, trained by years of battle, saw what the others hadn't: the discipline of someone who understood that mastery came not from pride but from patience. Still, respect and training was one thing. The real world was another. And soon the recruits would face it. Their program wasn't just about drills and exercises, it was preparation for deployment. Beyond the safety of their barracks lay a region torn by conflict, where border villages lived under the constant threat of insurgents and raiders. Rumors spread among the recruits like wildfire, stories of ambushes, night raids, and innocent lives caught in the crossfire. For most of them, it was a distant nightmare, something they barely believed until the day the commander summoned their unit to the briefing hall. The room fell silent as maps were spread across the table. Red markers showed villages recently attacked, blue lines marked patrol routes, and at the center of it all was a small farming settlement near the river that had requested immediate protection. Intelligence suggested a group of armed raiders was planning to strike within the next 48 hours. The recruits would be deployed there not for training but for their first real operation. The words hit them like a weight. Some clenched their fists with excitement, eager to prove themselves. Others grew pale, the reality of combat settling into their bones. Arya sat quietly in her chair, listening, her fingers brushing the side of her rifle. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. Fear was natural, but what she felt was something else. Readiness. The journey to the village was tense, the rumble of armored trucks carrying them across rough terrain. Dust filled the air, clinging to their uniforms, while silence pressed down heavier than the heat. No one dared to joke or boast now. Even Yarrick, who once strutted with unshakable arrogance, sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the floor. When they arrived, the villagers greeted them with a mix of relief and worry. Mothers clutched their children, elders stood at doorways, and the young men of the village helped carry supplies for the soldiers. It was clear these people had seen enough violence to fear it in every shadow. The squad was split into positions. Some guarded the outskirts, others took vantage points along rooftops. Arya was assigned to an elevated post near the old bell tower, her rifle resting against the edge as she scanned the horizon. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of crimson, and every sound seemed sharper: the creak of wood, the rustle of wind through the grass, the distant cry of a dog. Hours passed and the tension only grew heavier. The recruits whispered among themselves, but Arya stayed silent, her eyes never leaving her scope. It was just past midnight when the first movement appeared at the edge of the fields. Shadows slipping between the tall grass, the faint glint of metal under the moonlight. The raiders had come. A signal flare shot up from one of the lookouts and chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked through the night, villagers screamed, and the squad scrambled into position. The air filled with the roar of rifles and the acrid sting of smoke. Arya stayed steady. She adjusted her scope, tracked the raiders as they moved, and took her shots, measured, deliberate, each one finding its mark. While others fired in panic, wasting bullets into the dark, her rounds dropped enemies one by one, thinning their advance. Yet the raiders were relentless. More poured in from the east, and soon the fight spread into the narrow streets of the village. Yarrick and the others were forced into close combat, their shouts echoing through the night. Arya's vantage point gave her a clear view, and she provided cover fire wherever she could, cutting down threats before they overwhelmed her comrades. Still, it wasn't enough. The raiders moved with brutal coordination, and despite the recruits' efforts, the line was breaking. Then came the moment that would define everything. Through her scope, Arya saw one of the raiders slip through the chaos, carrying something heavy on his back. Her stomach clenched as she realized what it was: a makeshift explosive, crude but powerful, large enough to destroy half the village if it reached its target. He was fast, weaving between shadows, closing in on the heart of the settlement where families were hiding. No one else had seen him. No one else was in position to stop him. It was her shot or no one's. Her breath slowed, the world narrowing to the circle of her scope. Distance, wind, movement, she calculated them without panic, without hesitation. The raider ducked behind cover, sprinted again, every step taking him closer to disaster. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. She remembered her father's voice. When the time comes, you cannot afford to fail. Arya exhaled. The trigger broke beneath her touch. The shot rang out, slicing through the chaos, and the raider fell in an instant. The explosive tumbled harmlessly into the dirt, smoke rising from where he collapsed. The villagers were safe. The battle wasn't over yet, but something had changed in that moment. The impossible shot had been made. The night quieted only after the last of the raiders had been driven away, their retreat marked by the echo of boots fading into the hills. Smoke lingered in the streets, curling from broken carts and shattered walls, the sharp tang of gunpowder still heavy in the air. The recruits moved carefully through the village, checking corners, dragging the wounded to safety and accounting for their own. The villagers began to emerge slowly, their faces pale but their eyes filled with gratitude. Mothers clutched their children tighter, elders whispered prayers of thanks, and men shook the hands of any soldier they could find. The battle had been fierce, but the village still stood. And for that, much of the credit belonged to Arya. Her shot had not gone unnoticed. From rooftops and alleyways, the recruits who had been locked in the fight had heard the crack of her rifle and seen the raider collapse. They hadn't understood what had happened at first, only that something vital had been stopped. But when the explosive was recovered and the truth revealed, the realization spread like wildfire. Arya had seen what no one else did, acted when no one else could, and saved countless lives with a single bullet. As the squad regrouped in the square, their exhaustion painted across every face, all eyes turned toward her. She stood apart from the others, her rifle still slung across her shoulder, her uniform streaked with dust and ash. She didn't seek attention, didn't stand taller or bask in their stares. She only cleaned the barrel of her weapon with a cloth, the same way she always did, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But to the others, everything had changed. Yarrick was the first to approach. His pride had taken blow after blow, from the failed training exercise to his reckless mistakes during the raid. But this was different. His arrogance couldn't mask the truth anymore. He stopped a few steps from her, his jaw working as if the words burned to speak. Finally he muttered, "That shot, you saved us all." It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was the closest thing he had ever given to respect. Arya met his gaze briefly, her expression calm. "I saved them," she said softly, nodding toward the villagers. Then she lowered her eyes back to her rifle. Captain Vaynar was less restrained. The veteran had seen countless battles, had watched both seasoned soldiers and green recruits rise and fall under pressure. But what he had seen tonight was rare. He approached Arya with steady steps, his weathered face unreadable until he stopped directly in front of her. "That was no lucky shot," he said, his voice low but carrying. "That was discipline. That was preparation. You've got something most don't." His words carried weight, and the recruits who overheard them shifted uneasily, realizing that the girl they had once mocked now stood on ground far above their own. The next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, the village held a quiet ceremony. They had no grand speeches, no banners, only the sincerity of people who had nearly lost everything. The village elder, a man with silver hair and a trembling voice, stepped forward to thank the soldiers. His eyes lingered on Arya. "We owe our lives to your vigilance," he said, bowing deeply. Arya shifted uncomfortably under the attention, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to, the truth was already etched in every villager's eyes. The recruits, too, began to change around her. They no longer mocked her polishing, no longer whispered insults when she sat in the armory with her cloth and oil. Instead, some of them began to imitate her. They cleaned their rifles more carefully, adjusted their sights more often, and asked quiet questions about maintenance when they thought no one was listening. Arya never gloated. She offered small, simple answers, showing them how to check the bolt, how to notice when a barrel was wearing thin. They came to her not out of mockery now, but out of respect, though few had the courage to admit it aloud. Still, not everything shifted so easily. Respect didn't erase jealousy, and Yarrick, though humbled, still burned with resentment. To be outshone by someone he had once dismissed as weak gnawed at him. He trained harder, pushed himself longer, trying to prove that her moment had been an exception, not a rule. Arya noticed, but she didn't interfere. She wasn't competing with him, or with anyone. Her competition had always been with herself, with the quiet standard her father's lessons had set for her. That night, as the squad prepared to leave the village and return to base, Arya found herself standing by the river that bordered the settlement. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and the air smelled of wet earth and smoke. She set her rifle across her knees and polished it as she always did, the motion steady and familiar. For the first time since she had joined, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, to feel the weight of what had happened. She had been tested, not in a drill, not in theory, but in a moment where lives truly depended on her. And she had not failed. Her thoughts drifted back to her father's words. When the time comes, you cannot afford for it to fail. She understood them more clearly now. It wasn't only about the weapon. It was about herself. She couldn't afford to fail, not when people were counting on her, not when the cost of hesitation was measured in lives. The patience she carried, the discipline, the endless hours of polishing, they weren't small things. They were what had made her ready when no one else was. As the trucks rumbled to life and the squad prepared to move out, Arya stood and slung her rifle over her shoulder. The villagers waved, their gratitude silent but deep, and for the first time she felt something stir within her chest. Not pride, not vanity, just certainty. She belonged here in this fight, in this role. They had laughed once, but laughter no longer mattered. What mattered was the shot, the lives it saved, and the truth it revealed. And though she didn't know it yet, the impossible shot she had made was only the beginning. Greater trials were waiting, and the respect she had earned would soon be tested in ways none of them could imagine. When they returned to base, the air was different. The recruits had left as unproven trainees, but they returned as soldiers who had tasted the reality of combat. Their uniforms were stained, their eyes harder, their laughter quieter. Yet within the whispers that passed through the barracks, one name rose more often than any other: Arya. Word of her shot spread quickly, carried not only by her squadmates but also by the instructors who had observed the mission reports. Soldiers in other units, men and women who had never spoken her name before, now leaned in to ask, "Is it true? Did she really stop an explosive with one bullet?" Arya did not respond to the murmurs. She kept to her routine, polishing her rifle in the evenings, adjusting the mechanisms until they were perfect, and rising before dawn to practice her aim at the range. The attention unsettled her more than the silence ever had. She had never sought to be noticed. She had never wanted to be a story told in other people's voices. And yet, the respect she had earned was undeniable. Even Yarrick, though bitter, no longer dared to mock her. He trained with ferocity, but his glares carried less cruelty now and more of something else: envy sharpened by grudging recognition. It wasn't long before Captain Vaynar called her into his office. The room was sparse, lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. Maps covered the walls, pins marking conflicts and raids across the region. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You've drawn attention," he said, his gravelly voice steady. "Not just mine. Command has heard about what you did." Arya shifted slightly, unsure how to respond. Vaynar leaned forward. "They want to test you again. This time it won't be defense. It'll be precision. A single mission, one shot, but one that could turn the tide of an entire campaign." Her heartbeat quickened, though her face remained calm. Vaynar laid out the details. A notorious insurgent leader had been sighted in the mountains, operating from a fortified camp. He was ruthless, responsible for raids that had left villages burning and families broken. Capturing him alive was impossible. Too many had tried and failed. But if he could be eliminated, the raids would scatter, the threat fractured. The mission was dangerous, the terrain unforgiving, and the target almost impossible to reach. Almost. That word hung in the air like a challenge. Arya listened in silence. She didn't boast, didn't question why she had been chosen over others with more years of service. She only asked, "What's the distance?" Vaynar's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Farther than anything you've faced. Over 1,200 meters, through wind and elevation. It's not just a shot, it's a statement. If you make it, you'll do more than end a threat. You'll prove that discipline wins wars." The mission was set for dawn 2 days later. Arya spent every hour in preparation. She studied maps of the terrain, traced the ridgelines with her fingers, and memorized every possible angle. She adjusted her rifle again and again, checking the scope, the barrel, the trigger sensitivity. While others slept, she lay awake, calculating wind patterns, imagining the shot, replaying it in her mind until it felt inevitable. The others watched her with awe, whispering that she was preparing for something impossible. She ignored them all. When the day arrived, the squad moved into the mountains under cover of darkness. The air was thin, cold enough to bite through their uniforms. Jagged rocks tore at their boots and every step was a strain. Arya carried her rifle as if it were part of her body, her breathing steady despite the climb. Yarrick and the others followed, but it was clear this mission wasn't about them. They were there to guard, to clear a path, but the true weight of success rested on her shoulders. They reached the vantage point just as the first light broke across the horizon. The camp below was alive with movement. Guards patrolling, fires burning, shadows shifting in the early dawn. At the center of it all, the target stood, issuing orders with sharp gestures, his voice carrying across the wind. He was surrounded by men, a shield of bodies and weapons meant to make him untouchable. The squad set up their perimeter, scanning for threats, but all eyes eventually turned to Arya. She lay flat against the rock, her rifle positioned, her scope aligned. The distance was staggering. Even through the glass, the target was a small figure, barely more than a silhouette against the campfire's glow. Wind rushed between the cliffs, unpredictable and sharp. Any miscalculation would send the bullet wide, alerting the enemy and costing them everything. Yarrick crouched nearby, watching silently, his usual arrogance muted by the gravity of the moment. He whispered, "It's too far." Arya didn't respond. She inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in her lungs. She adjusted her scope a fraction, compensated for the wind and steadied her hands. Time seemed to slow. The noise of the camp faded, the chill of the mountain vanished. There was only the circle of her scope, the rhythm of her breath, and the memory of her father's words. When the time comes, you cannot afford for it to fail. She exhaled. The trigger broke smoothly. The shot cut through the morning air, a single thunderclap echoing across the cliffs. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the target crumpled, collapsing into the dirt, the camp erupting in shouts of confusion. Guards scrambled, searching the ridges, but it was already too late. One shot, one life ended, and with it the strength of their raids shattered. Arya pulled back from the scope, her face calm, her heart steady. Around her, the squad stared in silence, their disbelief giving way to awe. Yarrick whispered, almost to himself, "Impossible," but impossible had just been done. The descent from the mountains was quieter than the climb. The squad moved quickly, weaving through narrow paths and jagged rocks, but the silence that clung to them wasn't fear, it was awe. No one spoke, not even Yarrick, whose usual arrogance had been ground down to nothing. They kept glancing at Arya, not openly, but with the kind of reverence reserved for things too rare to name. She walked as she always did, rifle steady on her shoulder, face calm, every step measured. To her, the shot wasn't about glory. It had been necessary, nothing more, nothing less. Yet in the minds of those who had witnessed it, the story had already grown into legend. By the time they reached base, word had traveled ahead of them. The mission report had been filed and the details, though sparse, were enough to spark wildfire across the ranks. Soldiers crowded the barracks, eager for a glimpse of the girl who had done the impossible. Some called her the ghost of the ridges, others the one-shot soldier. They whispered that no distance was too great for her, that she could see what others couldn't, that she didn't miss. The rumors stretched and twisted, but at their core they carried the truth. Arya had changed the game. Command wasted no time. Within hours she was summoned to the officers' hall. The room was filled with brass, men and women with medals on their chests, faces hardened by years of battle. They looked at her not as a recruit anymore but as a weapon, a tool to be honed and directed. The commander spoke bluntly. "Your shot crippled their leadership. Raids have slowed, villages are reporting quiet. You've bought us time. But time is only a beginning. From now on your assignments will be different. You are no longer just another soldier, you are a marksman. A specialist." Arya listened without expression. She didn't crave the titles or the attention. She only cared that her skill could save lives, that the lessons her father had carved into her soul had purpose. Still, she knew the weight that came with it. A specialist was not hidden in the crowd. A specialist carried the burden of being the last line, the deciding factor. It wasn't just about cleaning rifles in silence anymore. It was about stepping into the line of history, where every mistake could echo across battlefields. Outside, the squad wrestled with the shift in their own way. Some felt pride, claiming they had fought beside her, that they were part of her story. Others carried bitterness, the sting of being overshadowed by someone they had once mocked. Yarrick in particular grew restless. He trained longer than anyone, pushing himself to exhaustion, but the shadow of her shot loomed over him. He wanted to prove he wasn't lesser, but deep down he knew the truth, that Arya's calm, her patience, her devotion to detail, was something he couldn't replicate no matter how many hours he bled into the ground. News of the shot spread beyond their walls as well. On the radio waves used by insurgent groups, a name began to circulate. They didn't call her Arya. They called her the Watchful Eye. Fear crept into their voices as they spoke of her bullet that crossed mountains, of the leader who fell without warning. Some said she was a spirit, others said she had struck a deal with death itself. Superstition swirled where truth could not reach. And in the villages she had protected, mothers told their children of the girl who guarded them from the hills, a quiet protector who never missed. But Arya herself felt none of the grandeur. Alone in the armory, she polished her rifle as always, cloth moving in steady circles across the barrel. The cheers outside, the whispers, the myths, they belonged to others. To her there was only steel and patience, breath and precision. She thought of the man she had killed, not with guilt but with gravity. Every shot had a cost and she carried it in silence. She knew that each time she pulled the trigger, the world shifted slightly for better or worse. That weight pressed on her shoulders heavier than any metal could. Captain Vaynar visited her that night. He leaned against the doorframe watching her work. "You've changed the tide," he said quietly. "But tides don't stay still. They push back." Arya glanced up, her hands pausing. "They'll come for me," she said simply. Vaynar nodded. "Yes. They'll hunt you harder now because you've become more than a soldier to them. You're a symbol. And symbols are dangerous." His words lingered in her mind as days turned into weeks. Patrols grew quieter, raids less frequent, but scouts reported unusual movements. Insurgent forces consolidating, regrouping, planning something larger. It was clear they had not been broken, only wounded. And like any wounded beast, they would strike with fury. Arya prepared in silence. She knew another test was coming, one greater than the last. She could feel it in the air, in the nervous glances of her comrades, in the way command's eyes sharpened whenever they spoke to her. She was no longer just Arya, the girl polishing guns in the corner. She had become something else, something larger, something she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. As she sat alone beneath the dim lights of the armory, her rifle gleaming in her hands, she whispered the words she had carried since childhood. "When the time comes, I cannot afford to fail." The time was coming again. And this time it would not be a single shot that decided everything. It would be war. The first signs of the storm appeared in fragments. Scouts reported strange patterns in enemy movement. Camps shifting overnight, supply lines running deeper into the forests, old trails suddenly abandoned. It was as if the insurgents were coiling inward, drawing strength from the shadows, preparing to strike. At first, command thought it was desperation, a retreat. But Arya knew better. She could feel the silence pressing on the horizon, heavy and unnatural, the kind that comes before thunder splits the sky. Whispers reached the base. The insurgents had put a price on her head. They no longer saw her as just a soldier. She was their ghost, their nightmare in human form. Propaganda broadcasts carried her name, twisting the truth into something monstrous. They claimed she had killed children, that she was a heartless machine, that she hunted for sport. Lies, carefully woven, meant to turn fear into hatred. Arya read the transcripts without flinching, though deep inside she felt the weight of being made into both monster and myth. She had never asked for this war of stories. All she wanted was to defend, to protect. But now she was a target larger than any she had ever aimed at. Her squad felt the pressure too. Every patrol became tense, every shadow watched twice. Soldiers who had once mocked her now walked closer, their eyes scanning the ridges as though invisible enemies lurked in every rock. Yarrick, though still restless, had stopped challenging her. He moved with a quiet protectiveness as if he knew that whatever storm was coming, he would be measured not against her shot, but by whether he could stand beside her when the tide broke. Even Captain Vaynar seemed harder, his gaze sharp whenever he looked at her, as though trying to read whether the girl who had landed an impossible shot was ready to survive being hunted for it. One night the warning came. A convoy returning from the Northern Watch reported an ambush like none before. Snipers in the trees, mortars hidden under camouflage, tactics too precise for ordinary raiders. The insurgents had grown disciplined, organized. They weren't lashing out blindly. They were gathering everything, focusing on one goal. And the message they left on the wreckage made it clear: bring us the watchful eye. Arya stared at the words painted in crude black strokes on the side of a burned vehicle. The letters dripped like blood in the fading sunlight. Around her, soldiers muttered curses, some spitting at the ground, others tightening their grips on their rifles. To them, the message was meant to break morale, to plant fear. But to Arya it was different. It was a promise. They weren't going to wait for her to find them anymore. They were coming. Command convened an emergency council. Maps sprawled across tables, red markers showing reported sightings and attacks. The officers debated fiercely. Some argued to hide her deep within the base, shielded until the insurgents lost momentum. Others demanded she be used as bait, drawing the enemy into a trap. Through it all, Arya sat in silence, her eyes tracing the patterns on the maps, the arcs of movement, the pressure points. She didn't see chaos. She saw a design. They weren't just hunting her. They were building towards something greater, something that would shake the entire region if left unchecked. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but steady. If they want me, they'll come with everything they have. If we hide, they'll strike elsewhere until I'm forced out. If we bait them, they'll expect the trap. The only way forward is to anticipate their move and strike first. The room fell silent. It wasn't the voice of a recruit speaking. It was the voice of someone who had looked into the scope and seen truth on the other end. Captain Vaynar nodded slowly. Then we prepare. Not for defense, not for bait. For war. The days that followed were unlike anything the base had seen before. Trenches were dug, supplies rationed, ammunition counted and recounted. Every soldier trained harder, their drills sharp with urgency. Yet beneath it all ran a current of unease, because this wasn't just about territory anymore. This was personal. Every man and woman knew they weren't fighting to hold the line. They were fighting because their enemy wanted one of their own. And no soldier was going to let her stand alone. Arya spent the nights on the firing range, perfecting shots at distances most considered absurd. She adjusted for wind, for curvature, for the subtle trembling of her own breath. Every pull of the trigger was another whisper to herself, I will not fail. But she also felt the eyes on her, the weight of expectation. She had been elevated into something more than human, a shield, a symbol, a story. And she knew stories could not afford to falter. On the eve of battle, she sat alone at the edge of camp, staring out at the black expanse of the forest. Somewhere in that darkness they were waiting, gathering, planning. She thought of the man she had killed in the mountains, of how one shot had shifted the balance so sharply. This time she realized one shot would not be enough. The enemy was no longer a single figure across a ridge. It was an army. And they were coming for her with the fury of every wound she had dealt them. When Captain Vaynar found her, he said nothing at first. He simply stood beside her, watching the tree lean. At last he murmured, tomorrow the story changes again. Are you ready for that? Arya didn't look at him. Her hands rested on her rifle, the steel cool beneath her fingers. I was ready the day they laughed at me, she said softly. I'll be ready tomorrow. Dawn broke under a sky of iron. The forest beyond the base was hushed, a silence so absolute it seemed to suffocate even the wind. Soldiers stood along the barricades, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the tree-line. No birds sang, no leaves rustled. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, as the sun's edge burned against the horizon, the silence cracked. A distant boom rolled across the valley, followed by the scream of artillery tearing through the air. The counterstrike had begun. The first shells slammed into the outer defenses, flinging dirt and fire skyward. Barricades splintered, alarms wailed, and shouts filled the camp. Within moments, the insurgents poured from the trees, waves of dark figures, moving with a precision no one had thought them capable of. Mortars thumped from hidden pits, machine guns raked the walls, and through it all, their chants rose, echoing a single name, the watchful eye. Arya moved like steel amidst the chaos. She was already on the upper platform, rifle braced, scope glinting in the rising sun. Her squad covered her flanks, each of them fierce in their defense, but all knew the truth. The insurgents weren't there for the base. They were there for her. And if she faltered, the line would break. She steadied her breath, sighting targets with clinical precision. A gunner setting up a mortar, gone. A commander signaling troops, gone. Each shot bought precious seconds, carving cracks in the enemy's momentum. But for every man she dropped, 3 more surged forward, relentless, fanatical. The base trembled under their assault, explosions shuddering through the ground. Smoke curled into the sky like black fingers, blotting out the morning light. Hold the line. Captain Vaynar roared, his voice cutting through the roar of battle. Every second counts. The insurgents pressed closer, and soon the fighting reached the outer barricades. Steel met steel, rifles cracked point blank, and grenades thundered within the trenches. Arya's squad stayed tight, protecting her perch, but she could feel the pressure mounting. Her rifle barrel grew hot, her arms ached, yet she forced herself to keep moving, keep aiming. The battle was no longer just survival. It was about proving that her legend was not a fragile story, it was a shield her people could believe in. Then she saw him. Through the smoke and haze, on a ridge far beyond the main assault, a figure stood taller than the rest. Clad in dark armor, bearing a banner marked with blood-red stripes, he commanded with simple gestures that rippled like waves through the enemy ranks. This was no ordinary leader. This was the architect of the counterstrike, the one who had turned scattered insurgents into an army. He raised his arm, and with it the entire enemy force shifted, their assault narrowing, focusing on the weak point of the barricade. If that section fell, the base would be overrun. It was a shot beyond reason. The distance was immense, the wind whipped erratically through the valley and smoke blurred the air. Any other sniper would have dismissed it as impossible. But Arya had been dismissed before. She had lived in impossibility, forged her skill in the mockery of others, and carved her name into silence with one perfect shot. She dropped to her knee, adjusted her scope, and let the world fall away. The screams, the thunder of gunfire, even the pounding of her own heart faded. All that remained was the ridge, the figure, and the faint glimmer of light on his armor. Her breath slowed, her finger tightened, and with a calm that felt almost sacred, she pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked. The bullet cut through the storm. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the figure staggered. His banner slipped from his hand, tumbling into the dirt. The ripple that followed was instant. The enemy surge faltered, their chants broke into confusion, their precise formations shattering like glass. Panic bled into their lines, and within minutes the counterstrike turned from fury to chaos. Soldiers who had marched with fanatical purpose now stumbled, retreating into the trees, their unity broken by the fall of their leader. Around her, the base erupted in shouts of triumph. Soldiers who had braced for death now surged forward with renewed strength, pushing back against the collapsing wave. Smoke still curled from the barricades, blood still soaked the dirt, but the impossible had been done. The counterstrike had failed, broken by one shot. Arya lowered her rifle slowly, her arms trembling from the weight of it all. She wasn't smiling, wasn't basking in glory. She simply breathed, long and steady, as the world came crashing back into sound and fury. The impossible shot had been real. She had carried the weight of every doubt, every laugh, every sneer, and in a single breath she had silenced them all. When Captain Vaynar reached her, his uniform torn and bloodied, he didn't speak at first. He just placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and heavy, a gesture of respect few soldiers ever earned. Finally he said, voice low but sure, "They'll tell stories about today for 100 years. And they'll all start with you." Arya looked out at the valley, where smoke and fire still clung to the edges of dawn. She thought of the girl who once polished rifles while others laughed. That girl was gone. What stood in her place was something forged by doubt, hardened by war, and defined by one unshakable truth. When the impossible came, she did not miss. The end.